The galaxy ignored the warning about humanity until the reckoning arrived. The vote had already started when I walked into the chamber. I did not run. I did not raise my hand or call out. I simply took my seat at the far end of the curved table, opened my data tablet, and watched 47 representatives of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations laugh at the document my people had spent 4 decades preparing. My name is Ilara Voss. I was 39 years old that morning, a commander in the human Xenodiplomacy Corps, and the only human being in a room that held the combined political weight of 6 elder civilizations. I had been awake for 22 hours. I had crossed 4 star systems to be present for this vote. And in the time it took the Keth senior senator, a tall, gray-skinned elder named Counselor Veth, to finish reading the cover page of our threat intelligence report aloud to the chamber, in a tone that made his colleagues smile, I understood that none of it had mattered. He did not read the full title. He read 4 words, paused, and let the room react before continuing. The Andai delegation leaned together and spoke quietly to each other. 2 Sarathi ministers actually smiled. The Duvari representative, a small, quiet species that most elder civilizations had long since stopped including in substantive debates, sat very still and watched me from across the table. Her eyes did not leave my face. I kept my expression neutral. That is something humans are extraordinarily good at when we need to be. Counselor Veth set the report down, folded his long fingers together, and looked directly at me. He had the patient, distant warmth of someone who has decided to be kind to a child who has made an embarrassing mistake in public. He said, in the common tongue, that he appreciated humanity's enthusiasm for contributing to conclave intelligence discussions. He said that the report would be reviewed by the appropriate archival committee. He said that humanity, as the youngest member of the conclave, should perhaps focus its considerable energy on developing its own internal infrastructure before turning its attention to threats at the outer spiral rim. He said the youngest child at the table should not try to teach the elders about storms. He said that last line in his own language first, and the Keth delegation laughed. I recorded it. I record everything. What he did not say, what none of them said, because none of them had read past the cover page, was that our report contained 40 years of continuous signal data from 17 independent human monitoring stations positioned at the outer rim. It contained trajectory modeling, fleet behavior analysis, resource consumption projections, and 3 separate extinction event case studies drawn from galactic history, all cross-referenced against a pattern we had first detected in the movements of a nomadic predator fleet called the Voakai when I was barely out of university. The Voakai were not pirates. They were not a border nuisance or a regional hazard. They were a civilization-ending force that had been slowly, methodically building toward the inner systems for nearly half a century, and every piece of data we possessed pointed to the same conclusion. Within 30 to 40 years, they would arrive, and the galaxy would not be ready. We had been watching them for 4 decades. Nobody else had been watching at all. The vote took 11 minutes. The report was tabled for archival review. That meant it would sit in a data vault with approximately 12,000 other documents that the conclave had decided were not worth immediate attention. The meeting moved on to a trade tariff dispute between the Sarathi and the Andai. Someone served refreshments. The Duvari representative passed me on her way out and said nothing, but she pressed a small folded data chip into my palm without stopping. I looked at it in the corridor outside. It contained a single line of text in her language, which I had taken the time to learn 2 years earlier because nobody else in the human diplomatic corps had bothered. The line translated roughly as, "We remember a fleet like that. We were not ready either." I stood in that corridor for a long time. I want to be clear about something because this matters. I was not angry when I walked out of that chamber. Anger is a short-term response. Anger burns fast and leaves you hollow. What I felt was something older and quieter, the kind of feeling that lives in the chest and does not go away, the kind that turns, over years, into something that looks a great deal like patience from the outside, but is actually something more like purpose. Humans have a word for it in some of our older languages. It translates, loosely, as the decision to act because you know what it costs to be unprepared. It is not a feeling most species would recognize. It comes from a history that most species have not lived. We nearly went extinct, more than once, not in the comfortable, distant historical sense that elder civilizations carry, not the polished memory of a hardship that happened so long ago it has become a source of dignity rather than real weight. I mean genuinely, nearly, catastrophically gone. Ice that covered half our planet, a plague that crossed every border we had, 2 centuries of internal conflict that brought us close enough to the edge that the outcome was genuinely uncertain. And through every single one of those moments, some group of humans, always a small group, always people that the majority found inconvenient or alarmist or simply too loud, kept watching, kept warning, kept building contingencies for a future that no one else wanted to think about. That is who we are. That is what we are made of. The conclave did not understand that. They looked at us and saw 80 years of membership, a modest fleet, a handful of colonies, and an enthusiasm for participation that they found charming in the way that a large animal might find a small animal charming. They did not see the 80 years before that, or the 200 before that, or the 10,000 years before that. All the accumulated weight of a species that has learned, over and over and over again, that the warning that is ignored today becomes the catastrophe that cannot be survived tomorrow. I filed my full report to Conclave Records that evening. I noted the vote outcome. I noted Councillor Veth's remarks verbatim. I attached every piece of source data, clearly labeled, with a summary document that could be read in under 10 minutes by anyone who chose to. Then I opened a secure channel to Earth, to the Human Defense Compact's Central Command, and I sent a different message entirely. It did not contain analysis or projections. It contained a single instruction, authorized under the Compact's emergency preparedness provision, a provision that had been drafted quietly, specifically, for this exact scenario. The message header read, "They will not listen, we prepare anyway." I closed the channel. I looked out the viewport at the stars. Somewhere beyond the visible curve of the galaxy's outer arm, something was moving toward us, slow and certain, the way that real threats always move, not in a rush, but with the particular patience of a force that has no reason to hurry because it has never once encountered anything that could stop it. I was going to give it a reason. I ordered a meal, sat down at my desk, and began drafting the first operational outline of what would eventually become the most significant military and civil defense project in human history. We called it the Spine. At the time, it had no name. It was just a set of questions on a data pad and a list of things that needed to be built. I worked through the night. Outside, the Conclave station hummed with the ordinary sounds of a galaxy that believed it was safe. It was not safe. But it would be. That was what we were for. The first entry I made in the operational log was dated 30 years before the Volkai reached the inner systems. I wrote it in plain language, no codes, no diplomatic phrasing. I was not writing for posterity. I was writing so that when I woke up each morning, I knew exactly where I stood. It said, "Today the Conclave archived our warning. Tomorrow we begin building the answer." That was not metaphor, that was a schedule. Year 1. 3 new shipyards authorized under civilian infrastructure funding, not military yards that would draw attention and questions. Civilian yards, the kind used for freighters and colony transports, but built to tolerances that could be quietly converted within 18 months if circumstances required it. The engineers who designed them understood what they were doing. They signed documents that did not fully describe what they were doing. They were patriots of a particular kind, Not the loud, banner-waving variety, but the kind that show up in the middle of the night and do the precise, unglamorous work that keeps civilizations breathing. We spread the funding across 43 separate budget lines. To any auditor from any species on the Conclave's Economic Review Board, it looked like a moderate expansion of human commercial shipping capacity. It was, in fact, the beginning of the largest covert defense construction program any species had attempted in the modern galactic era. I do not say that with pride. I say it with the particular weight that comes from knowing it should never have been necessary. Year 3. A new doctrine developed by our Strategic Defense Council, a quiet group of 12 people who met in a building on an orbital station that appeared on no public registry. The doctrine addressed a problem that no other species had formally solved, because no other species had genuinely believed they would need to. How do you build a defense network capable of engaging a fleet of several thousand ships when your own fleet is a fraction of that size, using resources you cannot publicly acknowledge, in a time frame that no one outside your own species knows you are working to? The answer was not to build a bigger fleet. That was the old answer, the elder species answer, the one that assumed that the metric of military strength was the number of ships you could put in a line and push forward. The Sarathi had done that for 3 centuries. The Keth had done it for 5. It was a philosophy built by civilizations that had never truly been in danger of losing. We built a different answer. We built it in the shapes of physics and geometry and patience. The spine was not a fleet. It was a network. Thousands of prepositioned autonomous platforms, each one small enough to be carried by a single freighter, each one capable of operating in coordination with thousands of others through a distributed intelligence system that our programmers had spent 9 years designing. Each platform alone was a nuisance. Together, in formation, in the specific geometries we had calculated over years of modeling, they became something that had no name in galactic military vocabulary. We called it a web. The Voakai would eventually call it something else, but by the time they had words for it, the naming would no longer matter. Year 7. The Sarathi hosted a diplomatic integration summit on their capital station. It was the kind of event that sounds like an honor until you read the proposed agenda carefully enough to see that the primary outcome, structured across 9 sessions and 3 days of formal meetings, was for humanity to agree to place its autonomous defense capacity under joint Sarathi oversight in exchange for the prestige and protection of Sarathi protectorate status. It was, in other words, an invitation to stop being independent. I attended, I smiled, I shook hands or the appropriate equivalent with every delegate. I wore the formal diplomatic uniform. I gave a short speech about the importance of partnership between civilizations. I ate the food, which was not good, and said it was excellent. And at the end of 3 days, I signed the guest registry and 2 minor cultural exchange agreements and nothing else whatsoever. On the transport home, my aide, a young man named Owen Clay, who had been with me for 2 years and had recently begun to understand the shape of what we were doing, asked me if the Sarathi were going to be a problem. I told him that the Sarathi were a civilization that had been powerful for so long that they had confused their own comfort with the laws of nature. They were not a problem. They were a variable. We would account for them. He wrote that down. Owen always wrote things down. It was one of the qualities that made him very good at his job. Year 10. The Duvari reached out through a back channel, not their government, one of their military historians, a woman named Dr. Saren Mack, who had spent 30 years studying the event their civilization called the Hollow War, the near extinction they had survived 3 centuries prior at the hands of a predator fleet that shared several key behavioral characteristics with the Voakai. She wanted to share her research. She wanted to know if we were preparing. She wanted to know if she could help. We met on a neutral station, in a room I had reserved under a false transit manifest. She brought 2 data cores. I brought nothing, because I had already memorized everything she was likely to tell me, but I listened as though it was all new, because her experience was real and lived and held details that no model could have captured. She cried twice during that meeting, not from grief, from recognition. She told me that when she first reviewed our RIM monitoring data, the one copy she had obtained through academic channels before it was archived, she had to sit alone in her office for an hour before she could work again, because it was the same shape, the same trajectory, the same patient, terrible approach that her people had watched on their own instruments 300 years ago, with no one to warn and no time to prepare. I told her she was not too late this time. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You already knew everything I brought you, didn't you?" I told her that knowing something and having a witness are two different things. She joined our quiet network of allies that afternoon. The Duvari would eventually contribute engineering designs for defensive platform components that solved a structural problem we had been working on for 4 years. But more than that, they gave us something that cannot be manufactured or modeled. They gave us the weight of lived experience, the testimony of a species that had stood at the edge and looked over, and could tell us precisely what the edge looked like. Year 12. The Keth relay station at outer marker 7 went dark. The conclave classified it as a navigational incident, equipment failure in a region of disputed sensor coverage. The official report used the phrase unexplained signal loss and moved on. I updated my deployment models. I moved the estimated arrival window forward by 4 years. I requested a meeting with the conclave's intelligence review board formally through proper channels, with full documentation attached. The meeting was rescheduled 3 times and eventually replaced with a written response. The written response thanked me for my continued engagement with conclave security matters. Year 18. I was promoted to Admiral of the Human Autonomous Defense Compact. The ceremony was small, held on our primary orbital command station, attended by approximately 60 people. Owen gave a short speech. Saren Mack attended via secure transmission from the Duvari homeworld. A retired admiral named George Hadley, who had built the original spine concept in collaboration with me over 8 years of late nights and cold meals in windowless planning rooms, shook my hand and said quietly that he hoped we would never need it. I told him that we were going to need it. I told him that was why we had built it so well. He nodded. He did not argue. That was the thing about George. He always understood the weight of a statement and never tried to lighten it with false optimism. He retired that year to a colony on the outer edge of human space, close enough to feel the edge of the network, far enough to have a garden and a view of the stars. He deserved the garden. Year 22. The Keth admiral named Counselor Rath, the senior military officer of the Keth Fleet Command, contacted me on a private channel. Not an official channel, a private one, routed through a relay I would not have expected him to know about. He asked if there was a copy of the report that had been archived 12 years earlier. He asked if he could read it. I sent it without comment, full copy, all source data, all appendices. He read it for 3 days. Then he went silent for a week. When he finally responded, he did not send a message. He sent a request for a secure meeting. I granted it. He arrived alone, without staff, on a civilian transport under a borrowed transit identity. He sat across from me at a small table in a room I had used before for exactly these kinds of conversations. He was older than I remembered. He had the particular look of someone who has recently understood something that changed the shape of everything he thought he knew. He asked me plainly how long we had known. I told him the full number, the full 40 years, the relay stations, the trajectory models, the behavioral pattern analysis, the case studies. I told him about the Duvari. I told him about Saren Mack sitting in her office for an hour because the shape of the data was the shape of her people's worst memory. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Why did you keep preparing after we dismissed you?" I thought about the question. Not because it was a difficult question, but because I wanted to give him the right answer, the true one, not the diplomatic one. I told him that warnings are not bribes. You do not issue a warning and then stop protecting yourself if no one believes you. The warning and the preparation are not the same act. The warning is for everyone. The preparation is for us. We prepared because that is what humans do. We have always done it, every time. It is not strategy. It is character. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I did not expect. He said that the weight of that knowledge, of knowing what we knew for as long as we had known it, and continuing to act despite being dismissed, was a kind of punishment he would not have wished on anyone. I told him it was not punishment, it was just Tuesday. He almost smiled. For a Keth, that was a great deal. Year 28. Owen came into my office at 300 station time, which meant something had changed. Owen only came to my office at 300 when something had changed significantly. I looked up from my work. He placed a single data chip on my desk and said, "Outer marker 3." I picked up the chip. I did not need to read it to know what it contained. The Volkai had passed the outer threshold. They were no longer at the rim. They were inside the galaxy's recognized boundary zones, moving at a speed and in a formation that matched our worst-case projection models within a margin of 4%. They were coming. They had always been coming. Now they were simply close enough for instruments other than ours to see. I set the chip down. I looked at Owen. He was 31 years old, young enough to have known his entire career that this moment was coming, shaped by the long preparation the same way that a river shapes the stone it runs over. He was calm. He had been trained to be calm, and more importantly, he had been formed to be calm, by years of working alongside people who understood that the time to be afraid is before the storm, not during it. I told him to begin the activation sequence for the spine. Stage 1, quiet deployment, no public announcement. He nodded and left. I sat alone for a moment, not from indecision, simply from the particular stillness that comes when a long wait finally becomes a present event. Then I picked up my work and continued. Outside, in the wider galaxy, the Conclave's monitoring stations were just beginning to register anomalies at the outer rim. Their analysts would spend the next several weeks ruling out equipment failure, sensor drift, and navigational interference before concluding that the anomalies were real and required an emergency council session. By the time they convened that session, the spine would be 60% deployed. By the time they issued their first public alert, it would be complete. Some warnings, once ignored, become preparation. That is the only form of justice that actually works. The alert came through at 6:14, on a morning I had not slept through. I was already in my command chair aboard the human orbital command station when the Conclave's emergency broadcast broke across every communication channel in the inner systems simultaneously. It was the first galactic-level emergency declaration in 600 years, and it was formatted with the particular combination of careful language and barely contained desperation that comes from institutions that have never practiced saying the thing they are now being forced to say. The Volkai fleet had been formally confirmed. 4,000 vessels, organized in a formation that the Conclave's military analysts were, at that moment, frantically trying to categorize using tactical frameworks that had been designed for completely different kinds of adversaries. 4,000 vessels. The Keth home system had gone dark 9 days earlier. 9 days. The most powerful single-species fleet in the Conclave had been engaged, broken, and scattered in 9 days. The Sarathi Grand Fleet had made contact at a position called Ondi Reach 3 days after that, and the engagement data, what little had survived the communication disruption, told a story of absolute, efficient destruction. The Conclave's emergency broadcast was asking every member civilization for an immediate accounting of their defensive assets and requesting authorization for unified command. On my bridge, my communications officer, a quiet and precise woman named Helen Drury, looked up from her console and said, "Admiral, they're about to ask us the question." I said, "I know, tell them we're already moving." She blinked, then she smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that people make when something they expected arrives exactly on schedule. I had been issuing deployment orders for 9 days. 9 days since our outer monitoring network, the same network the Conclave had declined to fund, review, or acknowledge for 30 years, had confirmed that the Volkai fleet had passed the point of no return. Our forces had been moving into pre-planned positions since before the Keth home system fell. The spine was not being activated in response to the Conclave's emergency broadcast. It had been active for over a week. A Sarathi liaison officer named Ren Cole, who had been attached to our station on a routine diplomatic posting that had suddenly become something very different, stood at the edge of the command deck looking at the deployment map on the main screen. He was watching the indicators light up across 11 star systems simultaneously, platforms coming online, autonomous units linking into the distributed network, human vessels moving into geometries that matched no tactical pattern in any galactic military database. He said quietly, "How long have you been positioning for this?" I said 30 years. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I kept my eyes on the screen. I said, "We did." He did not respond to that. There was no response that would have helped. The first major engagement came 4 days after the Conclave broadcast, at a navigational junction called Threshold Junction, a convergence of 3 transit lanes that represented the most direct path from the Volkai's current position to the inner system's populated core. If they passed through uncontested, the next inhabited zone was a cluster of 6 worlds with a combined population of 11 billion. The Volkai lead fleet numbered 800 vessels. Our forward position held 200. I want to explain something about those numbers, because anyone looking at them in isolation would find the next several hours extremely surprising. The 200 human vessels were not there to fight 800 ships in a conventional line engagement. That is not what the spine was designed to do. The 200 vessels were the visible part of a system that extended across 17,000 cubic light-seconds of space, embedded in the geometry of the transit lanes, calculated to within a tolerance of 1/10 of a degree across every possible approach vector. When the Volkai fleet entered the junction, they encountered something they had never encountered before. Not resistance, not a defensive line, a field. Every angle of advance triggered a response from a different part of the network. Every countermove was accounted for. Every adjustment the Volkai made changed the geometry of the engagement in ways that, over the course of the battle, consistently rooted their heaviest vessels into positions where the accumulated effect of the distributed platforms created kill zones that no single weapon could match. It was not elegant in the way that stories usually describe battle. It was not a glorious charge or a dramatic reversal. It was mathematics, applied at scale, by people who had spent 30 years making sure the mathematics were right. 6 hours after the engagement began, the Volkai forward fleet broke formation. When the data was fully compiled, 597 Volkai vessels had been destroyed or disabled. 31 human vessels were lost. Helen said the numbers quietly when they finalized. She did not celebrate. None of us did. 31 vessels is not a number that permits celebration. Each one was a crew. Each crew was people. We had prepared for those losses the same way we prepared for everything, specifically, thoroughly, and with the full weight of knowing what each number represented. I made a log entry. I noted the outcome. I noted our losses by vessel name and crew count. I did not write about victory. I wrote about the gap between what the mathematics had planned and what the moment had cost. Later, after the debrief, after the secondary engagement reports, After Owen had updated me on the network's status across all 11 positions, I wrote one more line. I wrote they expected prey. We had stopped being prey a long time ago. We just never felt the need to announce it. The days that followed the first engagement were unlike anything the galaxy had experienced in living memory. Conclave ships, Keth survivors, Sarathi remnants, Ondi defense vessels began routing toward human-controlled corridors, not because of any formal agreement but because the human corridors were holding. The network was working. The geometry was working. Every species that had dismissed the warning was now navigating by the light of the answer. Refugee convoys began moving through our protected lanes. Civilian transports from 6 different civilizations, carrying families and records and the irreplaceable things that people carry when they flee. We guided them. We maintained corridor integrity. We did not ask for authorization or recognition or gratitude. We did the work because the work needed to be done, and we were the only ones prepared to do it. On day 11 of the active engagement, a Sarathi civilian transport carrying approximately 12,000 refugees docked at our primary station. Among them was Counselor Veth. He was older now. His gray skin had deepened. He moved with the specific stillness of someone who has survived something that he did not expect to survive, and who has not yet decided what that survival means. He was brought to the station administrative center, processed, assigned quarters. He did not request to see me. His file noted his former title. The processing officer noted it with the particular lack of expression that people learn when they encounter significant irony, and decide that reacting to it serves no one. He was safe. He would remain safe. That was not a decision I made about him specifically. It was simply the condition of being inside our corridor. We did not withhold safety from people who had been wrong. We were not built that way. But 2 days later, he requested an audience with me. I granted it. He came to a small meeting room, the same room I had used for the conversation with Counselor Rath years earlier. He was alone. He sat down. I sat across from him. I had tea. I offered him some. He accepted. We sat for a moment in the particular silence that exists between two people, when one of them knows they need to say something and is assembling the words carefully. He said, "I owe you an acknowledgement." I said, "You don't owe me anything." He said, "I said in public, on record, that the youngest child at the table should not try to teach the elders about storms." I did not respond. I let the silence sit. He said, "I have been living inside your storm preparations for 11 days. I did not know what it felt like to be a child who was right and an elder who was wrong. I understand it now." I looked at him. He was not performing regret. There was no performance in him at that moment. He was simply a very old member of a very old civilization, sitting in a room that his civilization's mistakes had never prepared him to sit in, trying to find language for a position he had never imagined occupying. I said, "The report is still in the Conclave archive. I filed a copy 30 years ago. Everything we knew is in there. Everything we said was going to happen happened. I would like, when this is over, for that to be formally acknowledged." He said, "It will be." I said, "Not for me, for the next time." He looked at me. He said, "Do you believe there will be a next time?" I said, "There is always a next time. That is the only thing history has ever said with complete consistency." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he drank his tea. That was, in its own way, the most meaningful act of recognition I received in the entire war. Not a ceremony, not a statement, not an official record. Just a very old politician, sitting in my station, drinking tea that he had not expected to survive long enough to drink. I returned to my command deck. The network was still holding. The Volkai advance had fractured into 3 separate subfleets, each one attempting a different approach, each one encountering a different expression of the same system. Owen met me at the door with an updated status summary. Helen had intercepted a Volkai communication fragment that our translation systems were working on. I sat back down in my chair. The war was not over. It would not be over for some time. But the shape of it had changed, and in the change was something I had not let myself feel in 30 years. The specific, quiet certainty that we were going to be enough. Not invincible, not unstoppable, enough. Which, when you have spent 3 decades building against an outcome that nobody wanted to believe in, is a word that carries more weight than any other. I did not close my eyes. There was still work to do. There is always still work to do. That is perhaps the most human sentence I know. On the 14th day of the second offensive arc, I lost Owen. He was not on a frontline vessel. He was in the network operations center of our primary orbital station, the same room where he had placed that first data chip on my desk 3 years earlier, and said outer marker 3. He was coordinating secondary network adjustments when a Volkai subfleet conducted what our analysts later classified as a precision strike on command infrastructure, a tactical adaptation we had not seen from them before. They had been watching us. They had been learning. In hindsight, it should not have surprised me. Any force sophisticated enough to cross a galaxy and destroy elder civilizations is sophisticated enough to adapt. The strike hit 3 systems in our network simultaneously. We lost 4 stations and 1 mobile command unit. Owen was in the mobile unit. I was on the main deck when Helen told me. She said it in a low voice, just the facts, because that was how we did things, and because she knew that any other approach would not have served either of us. I said acknowledged. Then I said, update the network routing around the lost nodes. She did. I spent 45 minutes doing exactly what needed to be done, coordinating the coverage gap, redirecting autonomous units, ensuring the network integrity held across all remaining positions. Then I went to my private office for exactly 11 minutes. I sat. I did not move. I thought about Owen at 25, coming to work for me with 2 data pads and a talent for memorizing operational detail that I had never seen matched in anyone else. I thought about the way he wrote things down in actual notebooks, physical ones, paper, which he claimed helped him think. I thought about the speech he gave at my promotion ceremony, which was 4 minutes long and contained more genuine insight into the nature of our mission than most official documents produced in the same period. Then I went back to the command deck. I made a log entry that night, 1 sentence. I wrote, Owen deserved a different kind of war. I have never written anything harder. In the weeks that followed, as the campaign moved into its consolidation phase, I was formally appointed Joint Commander of the Coalition Defense Force, the first human being to hold galactic military authority. It was not a ceremony I had anticipated. The conclave convened it in a temporary facility on a neutral station because the previous meeting chambers had been destroyed or evacuated. There were no formal robes or ancient protocols. Councillor Veth was present. Councillor Wrath of the Keth was there via secure transmission from a rescue vessel. The Duvari sent Dr. Saren Mack as their representative. When the vote was read, Saren looked at me across the room and gave a very small nod. It was the nod of someone who had done the survivor's arithmetic and was satisfied with the result. The position was not what the stories make it. It was not standing on a bridge issuing decisive commands while the camera angle made everything look very serious. It was meetings, extremely complicated meetings. The Andai wanted to pursue Volkai remnants beyond the defensive network boundary, which our models showed would overextend our coverage and create exactly the kind of gap the Volkai had been probing for. The Sarathi wanted to restructure the Coalition's command system in a way that would have placed human operational authority under a review board that met quarterly. I spent 3 days in negotiation on that particular point, and the outcome was a compromise that satisfied no one fully and avoided catastrophe, which is the definition of successful negotiation. The minor species, 22 civilizations that the elder powers had never fully integrated into conclave governance, began, for the first time, attending coalition sessions as full participants rather than observers. This was not an accident. I had insisted on it as a condition of accepting the joint command, Saren Mack noted. In a message she sent me after the first session, that the Duvari had waited 3 centuries for that seat. I told her I was sorry it had taken the galaxy a war to make space at the table. She said that is how it usually works. The question is whether they remember the lesson. That question stayed with me, because there was something I had not told anyone yet, something that the coalition's intelligence team had been quietly working on for 6 weeks, something that I had kept out of official reporting pending full analysis. The captured Volkai command presence. When our forces had disabled the lead fleet's coordination vessel at Threshold Junction, we had not destroyed it. Our network had been designed, in one specific sub-protocol that only 4 people knew about, to disable rather than destroy a command-level vessel if the opportunity presented. I had been waiting for that opportunity for 7 years. I had designed the sub-protocol myself. The logic was simple. The only way to understand a threat completely is to communicate with it. The Volkai command presence was not a single individual in the way most galactic species understand command. It was a distributed intelligence, multiple nodes linked across the vessel's systems, capable of collective reasoning at a speed and scale that our translation teams found genuinely difficult to work with. But it was not hostile to communication. When our specialists made contact, carefully, incrementally, over 6 weeks of patient work, the presence did not attempt deception or delay. It communicated. What it communicated was not an apology. It was not a justification. It was an account. The Volkai had not chosen the inner systems arbitrarily. They had been moving for 2 centuries, and they had been moving away from something. Something at the outer edge of the galaxy, beyond the last surveyed systems, beyond even the rim monitoring stations that humanity had placed over 4 decades. Something that had destroyed 4 Volkai population centers before the surviving fleets had abandoned their territory and begun moving inward. Something that the Volkai had no weapon for, no defense against, no language to adequately describe. They had been coming because they had nowhere else to go. I sat with this information for 3 days before I shared it with anyone. In those 3 days, I thought about a great many things. I thought about the Volkai fleet arriving at the inner systems not as conquerors by choice, but as refugees without language, without the diplomatic capacity to ask for passage, without any expectation that the civilizations in their path would do anything other than resist. I thought about what would have happened if the Conclave had listened to the warning 30 years ago, if they had engaged our data, investigated the Volkai's trajectory, perhaps made contact when the distances were still large enough for a different kind of conversation. I thought about 11 billion people in the inner system cluster, who had been a week's advance from the path of 4,000 vessels. I thought about Owen. I thought about all of it at once. The way you think about something when you are trying to be honest with yourself about its full shape, rather than just the part that feels manageable. Then I called a closed session of the Coalition's senior staff, and I told them everything. The room was very quiet afterward. Then Helen said, practically, "So we're looking at a secondary threat of unknown scale from beyond the rim." I said, "Yes." She said, "And the Volkai might be the only civilization that has direct observational data on it." I said, "Yes." She looked at her console for a moment. Then she said, "I assume you have already started drafting the protocol for continued communication with the command presence." I said, "Page 47 of the report on your tablet." She found it, she read it, she nodded. That was the thing about the people I had built this operation with over 30 years. They did not need time to adjust to difficult information. They had been adjusting to difficult information since before some of them were adults. It was what the work had made them. It was, in a small and very specific way, what we had made each other. The Keth Admiral's question returned to me that evening. Why did you keep preparing after we dismissed you? I had given him one answer. Here was another, the one I did not say out loud in that meeting room but that I had understood for 30 years. Because the moment you stop preparing in response to being dismissed, you have accepted that the dismissal was correct. You have agreed that your judgment is subordinate to the comfort of people who have not looked as carefully as you have. And that is not a position that reality will ever honor. Reality does not grade on diplomatic curves. It does not reward civilizations for being confident. It rewards civilizations for being right, and then for building accordingly. We had been right. We had built accordingly. Now we had new information and a new calculation, and the only response to a new calculation is to begin again. I opened a new document. At the top I wrote, Secondary Threat Assessment, Outer Rim Initial Framework. Then I wrote the first question on a new list of things that needed to be understood. That was the job. It had always been the job. It would be the job tomorrow and next year, and in 30 years when someone younger was sitting in a chair like this one, watching instruments that nobody else wanted to watch. I wrote until late in the night. Outside, the coalition network held. The Volkai remnants continued to be processed through containment protocols. 11 star systems that had been in danger were no longer in immediate danger. The work was not done. The work was never done, but the shape of it had changed, and in the change was the particular, quiet satisfaction of a thing built correctly. Owen's notebook was still on the desk beside mine, physical paper, his handwriting. I had not moved it since the day Helen told me. I did not open it that night, but I did not move it either. Some things you keep close not because looking at them is easy, but because keeping them close is the only honest response to what they meant. I turned back to my document. I wrote the second question. Then the third. 5 years later, I retired. The retirement was not quiet. Nothing involving the coalition is quiet anymore, which is one of the many things that changed permanently after the war. The ceremony was held on the new conclave station, not the temporary facility, but a purpose-built structure that represented the first joint construction project in galactic history, funded across 41 species, designed by a team that included 3 human architects whose names are on a plaque in the entry corridor that I read once and have not needed to read again because I remember them. I gave a short speech. I wore my uniform for the last time. George Hadley attended, older now, thinner but present, which was the only thing that mattered. Saren Mack was there in person. Helen, who had accepted promotion to Admiral of the Third Network and was already deep in the work of the Secondary Threat Assessment Protocol, came for the ceremony and left directly afterward because she had a briefing. That was correct. That was how it should be. Counselor Veth attended. He sat in the third row and did not speak to me directly, but at the end of the ceremony he caught my eye and gave a very slight nod. I returned it. I understood what that nod meant. It meant, I remember. It meant, it will not happen again. It meant, in the particular language of old politicians who have lived long enough to be honest with themselves, you were right and I was not, and I will carry that in the way that things that matter deserve to be carried. That was enough. The day after the ceremony, I boarded a small transport and made my way to a station on the outer edge of human space. Not the farthest we had ever gone, but far enough to feel the edge of things, far enough to see the stars in a direction that still held questions rather than answers. I had a set of rooms, a desk, a window that faced the outer reach. I began writing. Not the operational logs, those were filed, reviewed, archived in the public record where anyone could read them. What I began writing was this, the account from the beginning, from the chamber where Counselor Veth read 4 words from our report and let the room laugh, From the corridor outside, where a Duvari representative pressed a data chip into my palm without stopping. From the night I sent the message that said they will not listen, we prepare anyway. I wanted it to exist as a continuous thing. Not as history, not as a military record, but as a human account of what it cost and what it meant, told from the inside. By someone who was there from the morning of the dismissal to the afternoon of the recognition. I am writing it now. But before I explain how it ends, or rather, where it turns, because it has not ended, I need to tell you about the session. The inaugural meeting of the Permanent Early Warning Council was held 8 months after my retirement, in the main chamber of the new station, attended by representatives of all 41 species in the coalition. The agenda contained one item, the formal ratification of the Early Warning Charter, which established, permanently and with binding treaty authority, a joint threat intelligence body in which humanity held a mandatory seat and veto authority over the classification of any intelligence report related to outer rim or unknown threat categories. It had taken me 20 years of quiet advocacy, 3 years of post-war negotiation, and the combined weight of everything that had happened to bring that charter to a vote. I was asked to deliver the opening address. I accepted. I stood at the podium in a room that held 400 delegates, plus transmission links to another 300 on distant stations, and I looked out at the assembled representatives of civilizations that had, in various combinations, dismissed, ignored, underestimated, sheltered within, fought alongside, and gradually come to understand humanity in a way that none of them had been willing to do when we had first walked through the door 80 years ago. I did not speak about victory. I had been very deliberate about that in the preparation. Every draft that leaned toward triumph was revised. Not because the victory was not real, it was real. It was built over 30 years of work by hundreds of thousands of people, and it was paid for at a price that I will carry until I no longer can, but because victory was not the lesson. The lesson was the gap, the 30-year gap between the warning and the reckoning, the gap that had not been necessary, the gap that had cost lives and civilizations and time that could never be returned, simply because the mechanisms for listening had not existed. I said that. I said it plainly, in simple language, and I said it looking at Counselor Veth in the third row. Then I said what I had come to say. I said, the Volkai fleet mine told us something that we have been analyzing for 5 years. I said, there is something beyond the rim, something the Volkai were fleeing, something that destroyed 4 of their population centers before the survivors moved toward us. I said, we do not know its shape or its timeline or its intent. What we know is that it exists, and that we have known it exists for 5 years, and that today, in this room, in this session, is the moment when that knowledge passes from a small group of people who have been quietly preparing to the full gathered authority of every civilization in this alliance. I said, we are not going to archive this one. The room was completely silent. It was the right kind of silence, not the silence of disbelief or dismissal, the silence of 400 people choosing, in real time, to take something seriously. I said, the Early Warning Charter exists for this moment, for the moment when someone brings information to this table that is difficult, that is uncertain, that challenges the comfort of assuming that the worst is behind us. It exists so that the answer to that information is action, and investigation and preparation, not archiving. I said, I have spent 40 years believing that warnings are only useless when no one is willing to give them. I am revising that belief. Warnings are only useless when no one is willing to hear them. Today, you are the mechanism by which that changes. The vote was unanimous. That evening I sat in my rooms on the outer station. The window faced the outer reach. I had been sitting in this room for 8 months, and I had not once gotten tired of that view. The stars in that direction were not different from stars in any other direction, but they held a quality that I could not fully explain except as proximity to the unknown, the sense that the next question was out there somewhere, waiting to be formulated. I opened my log, the same log I had been keeping since the night I walked out of the conclave chamber and stood in a corridor holding a Duvari data chip that said we remember a fleet like that. The log that had been running, unbroken, for 35 years now. I sat for a while before I wrote anything. I thought about Owen's notebook on the desk in my old office, which had eventually been boxed with my personal effects and which now sat on the shelf above my desk here. I had opened it once, finally, 6 months after his death. His last entry was a list of network routing adjustments he had been planning to propose at the next morning briefing. Practical, specific, useful. The last thing he wrote down before the end was a list of things that needed to be done to keep people safe. That seemed exactly right. I could not have invented a more honest ending for someone like Owen. I thought about George Hadley and his garden. I thought about Saren Mack working on secondary threat protocols with the same focused energy she had brought to 30 years of studying the Hollow War. I thought about Helen, who was almost certainly still awake on the third network flag vessel, reading the same kind of briefings that I had once read at 300, and handling them with the same combination of precision and care that the work demanded. I thought about the young analysts. There are several hundred of them now, not just human but Duvari, and a small number of Keth, and 2 species I had never met before the war who had approached us quietly in the post-war period and asked if they could learn to do what we did. The watching, the patient, rigorous, unglamorous work of keeping instruments pointed at the places where nothing has happened yet. They are good. They are better than I was at their age, because they have access to everything we built and everything we learned, and they are not starting from a place of being dismissed. They are starting from a place of being taken seriously, which is a gift I would have done almost anything to have had when I began. I looked at the stars for a long time. Then I wrote the last entry. I wrote, we were never the strongest species in this galaxy. We were never the oldest, or the largest, or the most technologically advanced. What we were was the species that remembered what being helpless felt like, and refused, on every morning of every year since we first reached the stars, to let that feeling be a permanent condition. We remembered ice and plague, and every crisis that we barely walked out of. We remembered what it costs to be unprepared, not as history, but as the thing that lives in the chest and does not go away. And we built from that memory, quietly, persistently, without permission or recognition, because that is what you do when you understand that the universe does not issue warnings, and the only preparation that counts is the one you do before you need it. I wrote, the galaxy listened tonight, all 41 of them in one room unanimous. That is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of the right structure for the next question. The question is already out there. The instruments are already running. The young analysts are already watching. I wrote, I hope they keep watching. I hope when the next warning comes, the vote goes the other way from the start, and no one stands in a corridor holding a data chip with the weight of a species' overlooked knowledge in their palm, having to decide, alone, whether to keep going. I hope the mechanism holds. I wrote, I will not be here to warn them a third time, but the structure will be here. The people will be here. The memory, all of it, the dismissal and the preparation and the cost and the long, patient, necessary work of being right when it would have been so much easier to be comfortable, that memory is now part of the record. That is what we leave behind. Not a fleet, not a network, not a title or a ceremony or a vote. The memory, the honest accounting of what it cost and how it worked, and what happens when you take a warning seriously, and what happens when you don't.